Well, let's get started. Welcome everyone to our Dermatology Breakout session. First, we have the patient experience panel, and I'm excited to join you both as a moderator and panelist for this portion of the session. So I'm gonna get started with introductions and then pass the baton to my fellow panelists here to briefly introduce themselves. So my name is Howard Chang. I'm a psoriasis patient and advocate and blogger. I've had psoriasis since I was a child for over 40 years now. And I would have to say that it's been a constant part of my life for as long as I can remember. All the dermatology visits, every treatment I can think of under the sun, including the sun. It's impacted my quality of life, my relationships, my work, you name it. Psoriasis has found a way to insert itself into my life story pretty much at every turn. My low point with psoriasis was about 15 years ago, and I found myself 95% covered with psoriasis after several failed treatments in succession. And I'll mention more about my mental and emotional state later, but it wasn't good, suffice to say. Psoriasis was never just a rash to me, but it completely took over my life at that point. My dermatologist at that time ran out of treatment ideas, so he sent me to a psoriasis specialist at University of California, San Francisco at UCSF. And through that consultation, I started a new treatment and it helped me break that prolonged flare. So I still have psoriasis on most every part of my body, not as much. And with better control and more effective treatments, it gave me space to consider how I could share my experience of living with psoriasis with others and possibly help others as well. And so I have a passion to share my story in a way where others with psoriatic disease can connect and be inspired to advocate for themselves and others and manage not just the physical aspects of it, but also the emotional and the spiritual aspects of living with chronic illness. So I started blogging in 2007 with Everyday Health. I have a column called The Itch to Beat Psoriasis. I've written for various sites, including my own, sohoward.com. And I volunteered with the National Psoriasis Foundation in a variety of roles, and currently as the co-chair of the Western Advocacy Committee. All right, so that's me. And I'm gonna have Alicia and then Becky, and then finally, Catherine will introduce themselves. So Alicia, take it away.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alicia Bridges, and I have been living with severe plaque psoriasis for almost 3 decades. I was first diagnosed in the early 90s at 7 years old after I had chickenpox. And then after the chickenpox went away, my grandmother noticed that my skin was doing something different and it was not healing correctly. So she took me to a doctor at that time who determined that I was living with psoriasis, and it has been a journey ever since. I've actually lived with being 90% covered longer than I've lived with having clear skin. So I've lived most of my life having very severe plaque psoriasis. And so I would definitely say that my turning point occurred 8 years ago after searching online for connection. This disease can make you feel very isolated, which we will talk about later, but I got online and found the National Psoriasis Foundation. I was very involved on online support groups, just sharing how I felt with living with this disease, and somebody connected me with the NPF, and I ended up at a patient conference. And that was a moment that absolutely changed my life, because for the first time, I went from knowing no one living with this disease to hundreds of people. So it was a pivotal turning point for me. And in that process of connecting with others living with the disease, I've figured out so much about myself and that I didn't realize while living with psoriasis, which we will talk about later with some of the mental health stuff. So in the process of that, I've started a blog, Alicia M. Bridges, where I highlight my different challenges and struggle with psoriasis. And then I'm also very involved in the patient research community. So I'm happy to be here today to share my story along with these other amazing advocates.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Becky Strong, and I have a disease called Pemphigus Vulgaris, where my body thinks that the cells that hold my skin together is foreign. It's an autoimmune blistering disease of the skin that also is a rare disease. So I'm also the International Pemphigus and Pemphigoid Foundation Outreach Director, one of the patient educators that travels to dental schools and dental conferences around the country and medical conferences as well. And then I'm also a peer health coach. So I share my stories and tips and tricks that I learned along the way with others in our community. For me, my journey started about 17 months before I actually got my diagnosis, and included 7 healthcare providers over the course of 17 months to get a diagnosis. Getting a diagnosis, just like Alicia mentioned, it was very isolating, and I knew nothing about this disease. I couldn't pronounce this disease, and I sure didn't know anybody else with this disease. I even asked my doctors at that time if there was a support group for people like me, right? They had a lot of patients and they said they didn't know one. So the big joke in my family is that I consulted my favorite doctor, Dr. Google, and that's when I found the IPPF. And it was an amazing thing to connect with people who just got it. Like Alicia, it wasn't very long after getting involved and finding the foundation that I attended my first conference. And to learn the similarities in our stories and our journey was simply amazing, and to talk to somebody who just got it. And then to find out that we had support from the autoimmune community and the dermatology community, it really made it feel like I was less alone in my own journey. And so in essence, I just want to say thank you for coming and joining us today. I've learned a lot joining some of the other sessions, and I just want to thank everybody for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine Schuster, and I have a skin disease called Hydronitis Separativa, or to save everyone, everyone just calls it HS. For anyone who doesn't know, HS is a chronic inflammatory skin disease that causes these really painful lumps and abscesses on the skin. Usually you find them in the armpit, chest, groin, inner thigh, buttocks, or back area, but you can actually get these abscesses anywhere in your body where you have follicles. And the lumps will cause tunnels under the top layer of your skin, and they can cause visible scarring, and they can be extremely painful. I experienced my first HS flare when I was 10 years old, but I was not diagnosed until I was 17. That's a pretty common occurrence for people with HS. I think it used to be that the average wait period to get an accurate diagnosis was 10 years. Recently has been down to 7, which is great. It would be great if it could be even less than that. And it is pretty common that people experience their first HS symptoms when they're like hitting puberty or in their teenage years. So for me, when I first experienced my first flare, it was pretty horrible because it was really painful and I had no idea what was going on. And my mother took me to my pediatrician. They didn't know what was going on. And so they just drained the boil, which is pretty common for HS, even though they're finding that that's not really what you're supposed to do anymore, and sent me home. And then I went to see a dermatologist. They didn't know what it was, sent me home. And at that point, I was a teenager dealing with these boils on my skin that were really painful, which would be horrible for anyone, but was really horrible for me as a teenager. And I pretty much ignored it and hoped it would go away. It did not go away, and my mom encouraged me to see a different dermatologist in the area that I lived in, and she was the one who diagnosed me with Hydronitis Separativa. And I think I talk about this a lot. I'm sure other people can relate to it, how life-altering and amazing getting an accurate diagnosis can be. It can be really upsetting because you learn, especially if you learn that you have a chronic illness that will never go away, but it can also be a really great tool to learn about your experience, what you're going through, find fellow people who are going through the same thing, find support groups. And so for me, it was a really amazing moment where I could finally tell people what was going on. After that, I pretty much went through every treatment you can think of for HS. I've been on every antibiotic, 2 different biologics, multiple surgeries, each to varying success. And kind of to deal with the frustration and all of my emotions and the experience, I started an Instagram called KS and HS, where I talk about my experiences with HS and other issues and try to inform people what HS is, but also it's really turned into a platform where I can advocate for better access to care, better awareness of what HS is. And it's really just been an amazing experience for myself. I feel like I've been able to grow in my ability to be empathetic, ability to advocate for myself. And it's just a really great outlet for me to cope and process HS. I'm sure later we'll talk more about mental health and coping skills. And this has definitely been a great way for me to process what it's like to live with HS.
All right. So as you can see, we have a wonderful panel, and I can already tell that there are a lot of connections with our experiences, even though we may have different conditions, but especially in this dermatology space and having these, for psoriasis as an immune mediated condition with these autoimmune aspects, and just having that chronic illness kind of always with us. I heard themes of like not being alone and how to cope. And so let's move into this this kind of topic of mental health and quality of life. And also just to note that if you do have questions, I think if you're in the Whova app or there's a QA section there. I don't think we can put questions into the chat at this point in Zoom, but if you have questions, then we'll see if we can get to any, but if not, we can reply to them later. The panelists can reply to them as they might be relevant to our experience. All right, so let's have each panelist share an example of how their dermatologic condition has impacted them in these areas of mental health and quality of life. And maybe speak to how you cope and a word of advice for those who are struggling to cope. So any of the panelists want to get us started? You can just jump right in.
I guess I'll get us started. I got psoriasis at a very awkward time in life. So at 7 years old, this is before the time of puberty, and puberty already has its own set of challenges. And so it's even more difficult when you're dealing with a visible chronic condition. And so I just remember being younger at that age and feeling very alone, feeling isolated, feeling embarrassed, feeling shame. I remember struggling with my self-esteem, feeling like I wasn't good enough, comparing myself to those around me who were not living with these type of conditions. And I dealt with a lot of anxiety. Now, at that time and at that age, I had no way of expressing that that's what I was dealing with. I realize now at 34 years old, when I have anxiety, I get irritable, which is a symptom of anxiety, which was definitely missed when I was a teenager. And in those moments where I felt really overwhelmed, it was always taken as though I was just being an unruly teenager. And so sometimes I look back and reflect on that moment, and I really wish I had more support, but I also have to realize that especially in the Black community, mental health is more so of a new focus, and we're starting to learn these terms of anxiety and mental health and depression and what that looks like. But one pivotal moment that I remember having in high school, I was in a pageant. I don't know why I decided to sign up for this pageant, but I had seen the girls the year before do it, and I was like, I want to do it too. I didn't show my skin. I knew that I would have to wear a gown, but I just don't know what possessed me to do it. I guess in the moment I wanted to feel normal, but then the reality started to hit in our dress rehearsals. And there was 2 instances where I felt really overwhelmed. When I went to look for the dress, I remember being with my aunt and grandmother, and they didn't know this, but I was in the dressing room. I was about 15 or 16, and I was having a panic attack. I was having a mental breakdown because I was just overwhelmed from trying on the dresses, seeing all this thick psoriasis on my arms, on my back, on my chest, knowing that I was going to have to go in front of all these people and to show that. And I just got so upset, and I was unable to find the words that I was overwhelmed. And then the second part of that is when I went to the first dress rehearsal, and I remember being in the bathroom and putting on that dress. And then I got out there and I was hiding my arms and I was pacing back and forth, and it was an overwhelming experience. I got in the car with my aunt and I exploded at her, and we got into this huge argument. And it wasn't until adulthood that I was able to verbalize what was going on with me internally then. So I cope in a couple of ways, and then I'll tie it up. One was connecting with others through support groups such as the National Psoriasis Foundation. Two was connecting with others online where I could share my story and be comfortable. Also finding therapy and talking through these different issues, and then learning how to advocate for myself when it comes to doctors. So that's just some things that I've been through mentally and how I cope.
And Howard, I'll go next. So my story is a little bit different than the other panelists in that my disease happened when I was in my early 30s, when I was diagnosed. And for me, I was an active, I could swim 80 laps and get out of the pool and, you know, go on with life, or run a 5K and then go to work in the morning. And this disease and dealing with the severe pain of having my skin come off really made it to the point where, like, it was a good day if I just breathed by the end of the day. And my disease and the subsequent treatment that involved mycophenolate and high-dose prednisone made me want to run a marathon and take a nap all at the same time. And I really think, especially after getting like a chronic diagnosis that's autoimmune, and hearing your doctor say it's something that can never be cured, it's something that could go into remission, but you're going to live with this forever, really has an impact on you. And I've heard others in our own community, in the pemphigus and pemphigoid community, relate it to PTSD, right? That anytime that we get one little lesion in our mouth or we start to have a pain, like all of that comes back to us. And that is absolutely true with me. When I was diagnosed, I truly felt betrayed by my own body. How can my body be attacking myself? And it took me a little bit to get past that. And I really kind of think I got in my own way to get better, because I was such a type A personality and needed to control everything. And how come I couldn't control this? One of the best pieces of advice that I got was to see a mental health counselor. And it sounds silly, but I was in her office and she's, you know, like, why are you here? And I went through that I got this disease and I'm falling apart and I'm constantly crying. And I just kind of broke down and I said, I don't feel in control. And like, I'm not normally like this. And she asked me a very simple question and just said, why? This is a major ordeal. How come you don't think it's okay to feel this way? And it was almost like she gave me the permission that I needed to grieve my health. And then from there, like, that was the first step in healing mentally for me. I was able then, you know, I went through kind of like the grief and the anger and all the stages that they talk about. And really, you know, it kind of launched me into a place where I could, instead of looking back and why did this happen? Okay, it's happened. Now, how do I deal with it? And how do I keep this, and, you know, having a long time to be diagnosed, you know, happening to somebody else? How can I help them get diagnosed quicker? How can I share my story and things that I've learned so they don't have to go through the trials that I went through? And really finding that purpose and being able to help somebody else, you know, if that's your purpose, or like starting your blogs, like those are great purposes. Finding something to give a positive meaning for something negative that happened really was a big stepping stone for me in getting better with my mental health.
Those are all really great points, Becky, and I like really related to a lot of them. And I wanted to bounce off the idea of having a chronic illness can feel a lot like you're grieving. because that's a concept that really resonates with me when I first read about that idea of grief being the feeling, the emotion of dealing with your chronic illness. It really spoke to me because grief is anger and sadness and feeling isolated and despair and disbelief all wrapped up in one word. And that is all of the feelings I have about HS. And it kind of, when you look at dealing with your illness, grieving your health or grieving the life you had before you were diagnosed, it kind of gives you space to be patient with yourself and give yourself grace. And that's something that I continue to work on and need to work on. But really, I really like that idea. And it's so important when you're dealing with your own mental health, is to allow yourself to acknowledge what you're feeling and give yourself grace. And another thing that I think is really great, but also a challenge for me, is asking for help. For such a long time, I assumed that no one would really care what I was going through. And that rejection would probably hurt more than having to deal with it on my own. And actually, KS and HS was partly born out of one of my best friends telling me that she likes it when I open up to her about living with HS and telling her what it's like to live with it and telling her what I need. Because if I don't tell her, she won't know. Which is such a simple concept, but for her to say it out loud and to kind of give me permission and to validate my need for help and I need to say what I'm feeling, it was like, okay, I need to share my experience more. I need to speak up and advocate for myself more and for others, because no one's going to know what I need unless I say it. And so that was a little bit of the impetus for starting KS and HS, but also is a great reminder to me to continue to advocate for myself. And also just one more coping mechanism. Starting KS and HS has been a great outlet for me because writing is a great coping mechanism for me. I'm able to write and post and share it on my blog or my Instagram, but also I can write privately for myself as well. So journaling has been an additional great way for me to process my mental health.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Writing was that way for me too. Just when I first got started, it wasn't so much I wanted to get, to have a bunch of people follow me, but I just really want to, I just need to get that out, and all the years and all the feelings and emotions. Yeah. And part of that, I think, was just, yeah. Sorry, Catherine, are you done, or could I?
No, I was just agreeing with you.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'll jump into my sharing a bit too, just kind of going off of that. And, something I think that I've thought more about more recently or more later in my journey with psoriasis is just what it meant to be an Asian male. Even though I was born in the States, my parents were immigrants. And I think there was really this, what was modeled to me from my dad or male figures, authority figures, was kind of that stoic, don't share your feelings, boys don't cry. And so my dad would tell me stories where he was in the village in China, and his dad, like, he would say he threw him out of the window. I don't know exactly what that means. I don't think they had glass in the village at the time, but just these stories of how, just kind of, be tough and get through it and don't show your emotion. I think that probably did a disservice to me in some ways. Thankfully, my dad changed as he got older, but when I was young and kind of dealing with all those emotions as a child that I didn't know what to deal with, how to deal with them, and then just held on to them for many years, from being bullied and all the stigma and people staring at me and all this stuff. I think that was, maybe it didn't give me the kind of coping skills or model that they weren't modeled for me. I mentioned earlier that I was covered 95% in my body about 15 years ago. And so probably all that was just kind of cascading on me. And I was feeling that shame, hopelessness, and I was pretty fatigued too. I think, I just couldn't do the things I wanted to do with all this inflammation on my skin. It just couldn't even really sit still. There's so much discomfort. And I remember one night in particular where I just felt just completely beaten down and broken. And I was just wanting to give up on everything. I'm a church, I was a church minister, and I just wanted to just tell the church, I can't do this anymore. I have nothing to give, right? I'm just, I need help on some level. I don't know how to ask for that, but I just can't help. And as a father, I have 3 children. They were younger back then, they're all in their 20s now, but I didn't have energy to care for them or do the things that I thought a good father should do. Didn't feel like I was a good husband, that I was failing my wife. You know, even just little things like I couldn't do the chores. My hands were just covered with lesions and sores, so I couldn't wash things or, you know, hold on to things too long, like vacuum cleaners. And so I just broke down in tears. I was sobbing, and I went through like half a tissue box, I think, and just didn't think I could get through another day. Thankfully, you know, I got that other treatment, and I started realizing how much I needed kind of to maintain not just my physical health, but my emotional and mental health as well. And so that was a low point, but certainly all these years, I've only had remission maybe, I don't know, 6 months out of 40 years, something like that. So I don't really go into remission. I just kind of go from worse to less worse. And so it's always a part of my life. And every day there's this kind of uncertainty. It seems a little better now than before, but you know, I could flare overnight. And so I would start, you know, talk about just kind of being traumatized, like just waking up and feeling like your body's starting to get all inflamed and everything. I think some of the ways that I kind of try to cope is just through daily life, trying to do the things I think that kind of release pressure, anxiety, and stress. I do a lot of walking. I used to do a lot more running, but my knees are giving out on me. I don't have arthritis, but I definitely, my body is kind of breaking down, so I can't run as much. But I love to walk and pray and meditate and just slow down. I'm learning to say no. I like to say yes to everything. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, why did I do all this? You know, and then just go through that cycle. And so just kind of been learning to say no and trying to, especially if my skin is flaring or I'm having a lot of negative thoughts and things, just to really, you know, calm those down. And then I think others have mentioned just kind of, you know, asking for help, not feeling alone. So whatever way to reach out. I have a great support team. I've kind of had to develop over time. I've had to learn how to ask for help, you know, from my wife, even my kids. Now that they're grown, they're a great support. They're really encouraging to me. Fellow advocates and patients. My dermatologist actually is a, you know, I like to make good connections with my healthcare professionals and you know, just reach out to them. And so to not struggle alone, you know, and there's a lot of communities online through organizations like Alicia and I have mentioned, National Psoriasis Foundation. So yeah, so that's kind of my sharing on mental health and quality of life. Anyone else want to chime in just before we move on to the next topic on any more? Yeah.
I love what was mentioned earlier about showing yourself grace. And I've been learning that as self-compassion. And I realize I've had to give myself that in a lot of areas of my life. Like I have really bad acne sometimes. And sometimes I look at my skin and I'm like, oh, I hate it. But then I pause and I say, I'm doing absolutely everything I possibly can in this moment. I'm going to an esthetician. I'm washing my face twice a day. So that's where that grace and self-compassion comes in. So I really love that aspect of our condition and looking at it in that way. So thank you for sharing that.
I agree with that. And I was going to comment on that too. A lot of our diseases are exacerbated by stress. And our self-narrative creates so much stress in our bodies that we don't even realize, right? And the more positive that we can be, I mean, we wouldn't talk to other people, and I guess I should say I would never talk to anybody in the same way that I talk to myself sometimes. And so Catherine, like you're absolutely right. Like I have to kind of recenter and refocus and be like, girl, would you say this to anybody else? Because if you would, don't be saying it to you, right? You don't need to manifest that in yourself. So great point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And just that trigger, right? It's not just the stress we're feeling and from our condition and life, but how we respond to it a huge way, and kind of how we think about it, how we process it, and how we respond to it. Because certain things are out of our control. but certainly there's certain things that we can, control, I guess, in terms of how we respond to things. So, yeah, so it's, we really see all these kind of topics that we've, kind of thought about for this panel. I think are all kind of connecting, and we're going to turn to access issues. And just this morning before we came on, I'm calling the specialty pharmacy for the 5th time this week, trying to get my Biologic. And so I thought, wow, this is kind of what we're doing. And that's another stressor, just getting our medication, because it's not always accessible or it doesn't always get delivered on time. And I'm actually behind now because I started early getting my processing it, but then now I'm late for my dose. So let's talk about these issues related to access to care for a couple minutes. And Becky, we'll have you start. And what has your experience been accessing medications? Have you faced any barriers in accessing them? And what advice do you have for those currently trying to access or gain access to medications?
Great question. So yes, and even more yes. In the derm experience, I think a lot of us with skin diseases, and especially those of us with a rare disease, getting a diagnosis is the first step, right? For me, my lesions started in my mouth and then spread a little bit to my skin. And when it happens in your mouth, you don't immediately think, I need to see a dermatologist, right? Mm-hmm. And then having this disease, we need to find specialists. And at least for the pemphigus and pemphigoid community, a lot of our physicians are centered around major medical centers or university hospitals. And so finding those physicians are hard. And so if you are having trouble finding a doctor, contact your organization for your disease if you have one. A lot of organizations have lists of doctors or researchers. For example, on our website, we have an interactive map that can be accessed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it includes doctors from around the world that we believe are familiar with, our diseases. So that's my first advice. Second of all, with my disease being a rare disease, many of our treatments are off-label. And, something that's close to the Autoimmune Association's heart is step therapy. And in my particular case, my doctor said we were going to start on high-dose steroids and mycophenolate. And if that didn't work, we're going to move to Imuran. And if that didn't work, it was going to be really expensive, but IVIGs were proven effective. And then the last step that I would go through, my insurance wouldn't cover it. And my doctor actually said it was a medicine that he wanted me to start on called rituximab that had been proven to put patients in remission, but my insurance wouldn't cover it. And it would end up being a treatment of last resort. And if it was something that I wanted to go on after completing these steps, I would still probably need to take out a mortgage on my house. And I think that not only hearing that you have a rare disease, an autoimmune disease, a skin disease, but now you're going to have to mortgage your house to get better is a lot, right? When I could have started this treatment at the beginning. And so we're delaying pain, we're delaying suffering, we're delaying, getting better and getting to remission and finding treatments that work. And so really learning what your insurance covers and doesn't cover, and like Medicare Part B versus Part D, and one covers infusions, but one covers prescriptions, and learning all of that is like a big step. The second step in that is also learning the appeals process and getting comfortable with that. And again, going back to what Catherine said, asking for help, talking to your doctor, talking to those national organizations that can have experience in the appeals process, or may have articles written by experts that can talk about that is a big deal. And another thing I think is not only that, but also that there is compendia issues. So CMS and other major insurers will look for national compendias and drugs to be considered on formulary or off formulary. The problem is sometimes there's very little oversight onto those formularies, and medications can drop off. And there's really no oversight on how to get a medication back on there, or if there is an approved treatment, to be able to get that medication back onto that formulary. And so really, truly big things, I think, are learning your insurance, like what's covered, what's not covered, learning how to appeal insurance, but then also getting involved in advocacy, right? Like there is the Safe Step Act that is, going through Congress and looking for support now, where it would make or let doctors be in charge of our medical decisions with specific exemptions. And so writing to your legislator or talking to your legislator, I don't think you need to go to DC, but even going to your local congressional offices, I think those are things that you can do as well. And the other issue too is looking at biosimilars. And again, appealing the insurance. Biosimilars are a lot of times less expensive than the name brand drug. At the same time, they aren't necessarily approved for, in our case, ours for pemphigus and pemphigoid. And so doctors are really trying to save patients money, but insurance companies don't want to cover the name brand and they don't want to cover the biosimilar either, right? So talking to insurance companies, about this, talking to your legislators, sharing your personal story. Pharma has big lobbying, but I truly think that like the patient story and the patient experience can go very far with your legislators to help enact laws that can benefit everybody in the community.
I think Becky just took my whole, all my points, all my bullet points. She just like copied them.
Sorry.
No, maybe I copied hers. No, that's fine. We only have a few more minutes left, but I think I'll just add quickly, because Becky was very comprehensive, and I don't remember if you mentioned this about going directly to the drug manufacturer. There was a time that I was denied, and I worked with my dermatologist, and that really helped out. And also I want to mention, for those with psoriatic disease, the National Psoriasis Foundation has the Patient Navigator Center, and that's another resource to go to if you're dealing with any of these kind of access to medication issues. I think in the psoriasis community too, it's we have so many new medications that have come out. I was on the first Biologic back in 2003, and I'm on my 6th now. And so, but we have more that I could try. But just the access part and the step therapy that Becky mentioned, I think is an issue for us. So we may have a lot of options, but sometimes we can't get to them in a timely way. And then we also will get those issues of worsening conditions and so forth. So we only have like a couple minutes left, but I really want to make sure that Alicia can speak to research and clinical trials. Sorry, you don't have as much time, but we definitely want to get this in as part of the patient experience. So Alicia, as a patient researcher, kind of quickly, what has been your experience? And could you speak to the importance of diversifying clinical trials in particular?
Thank you so much. I'll make this quick. So I'm a part of 3 different initiatives. The first one is Idiom, which is the International Dermatology Outcomes Measure. We have been working on a clinical survey that you will basically use in clinical trials. Right now, the issue with the surveys that are currently available is that they're all different. So it's really hard to compare data across different studies. And so what we're doing is creating a survey measure that can be used across all clinical trials so that we can get better data on treatments and psoriasis. The second one that I'm on, which is really special to me, is light. It is a study about light therapy's effectiveness on psoriasis. And why this is so significant is because a lot of times people of color are underrepresented in these clinical trials. And there are a lot of various reasons for that, but our skin is very different. And so a lot of the treatments that we receive are on the basis of the majority, and it may not necessarily be the best options for us. And light therapy for psoriasis is one of those treatments where that's happening. So, for me, I remember having light therapy growing up, and it went as long as I would go about 4 times out the week. Each time you go, you get more time in the light box. And so I think at one point I was up to like 8 or 9 minutes standing in this light box for psoriasis, and it was never effective. And one of the challenges with that is because we're not represented in those studies to really see how much sunlight it will take to show improvement for our skin, because maybe it will take more because of the melanin, but we don't know that because we don't have a lot of people of color in those studies. And so one of the focuses for that study is to really engage with the African-American community and other communities of color to get them involved. However, COVID has definitely prevented some of that work. And so it has definitely presented unique obstacles in doing that. And lastly, I'm with the National Psoriasis Foundation Citizen Scientists. And so that is where people in the community can go to this platform online and answer a total of about 50 questions about their disease. And then they're able to compare their answers with other people and kind of construct their own data. So for example, you know, I'm an African-American woman living in Georgia, and right now I'm about 10% covered. Okay, well, what is going on with women who live in Alaska? What's their severity like? So you're able to take that information and to create your own data scenarios and kind of compare to the other people who are also answering those questions. And so just to tie everything, I've had a great experience with patient research. It's helped me to not only advocate for myself, but to also advocate for other minority groups, including women, including age, because a lot of those studies are heavy with men who are white. And so in older men, so advocating for age, advocating for gender, and then also advocating for ethnicity. So that's what I've been doing as a patient researcher.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Alicia, and thank you to all of our panelists, including Becky and Catherine. We've run out of time. This is a big topic, so I'm glad we were able to touch on a few issues of the patient experience. And so we'll just conclude here. I believe there is a message from sponsor, and then clinical trials and drug development panel will be after that. Thanks, everyone.
At Bristol Myers Squibb, we believe that a single touch has the power to transform, to help make every day better, fuller, happier, healthier. So we are always working, proving that innovation and compassion work best hand in hand, developing clinical trials that better reflect the communities we serve, ensuring that every breakthrough reaches those who count on them the most, striving to change the world, starting with a single life, yours.
So first and foremost, I want to thank all the panelists that spoke prior about their experiences that they're having. You know, without those voices, without those direct experiences, the things we're going to talk about today as far as researchers, the physicians and providers treating those individuals, we're not able to do what we can do to help them and to help everyone in the community. So the second part of the breakout session today will really be focused on elements of research and those all-important clinical trials. So I am Dr. Stacy Bell, and I'm fortunate to serve as the Chief Scientific and Medical Officer for the National Psoriasis Foundation. You heard mention of the NPF in the prior breakout session. We'll talk a little bit more about our organization, some of the things we do. But what we'd really like to focus on today are the importance of clinical trials, the research that's ongoing right now in the fields of dermatology, and also the patient experience. We are really lucky. Alicia shared some of her experiences, but we also will have opportunity to hear more today. So if we go to the next slide. So as part of this session, I am joined, and I'm very fortunate to be joined by two of my medical colleagues, but also those committed to helping individuals living with dermatological conditions, Dr. Netta Sheriari and Dr. Brett Ringdahl. I am fortunate to work with Brett because I know more about his medical history too, but we will have them share their expertise and their lived experience. We'll start out the session by me talking a bit about the role of clinical studies and treatment development and options that patients have at their disposal. Dr. Sheriari will then talk about current research ongoing in dermatology, and Dr. Ringdahl will talk about his experience with a dermatological condition, but bring that back to the medical focuses that we'll speak to. And why is this session important for this conference. I think that the thing that we hear from a patient advocacy organization are the experiences we just heard from our panelists. How it impacts their day-to-day life, how they're trying to find the best treatments, really how they're trying to live their best life. And to be able to do that by having partners in their care, by being able to access their therapies, and really be able to have options available to them. And one of the best ways to have options is to have new treatments. And those treatments come to us and come to market through the clinical trial process. The difficult thing for me, being on this side now, and I'll talk a little bit about my background and being involved in clinical trials for many, many years, is there's still a lack of awareness of clinical trials, the availability of them, the conduct of them, the importance of them. And in addition, there is really a lack of education available for clinical trial conduct, for clinical trial involvement. So over the past couple of decades, and from when I started my career, there's a number of resources now available for the National Institutes of Health and the Food and Drug Administration, through many of the patient advocacy organizations you've heard from in this session. And of course, nowadays, there's a lot available on the web. But trying to discern and decide what's really important to that is something we hope to shed some light on today. So if we go to the next slide, these are just my disclosures. Obviously, I'm an employee of the National Psoriasis Foundation, and the views that really I'll reflect today are somewhat involved with my role with the NPF, but really with the 25 years that I spent within the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industry, being part of and running clinical development and medical affairs programs. Many of the programs from the National Psoriasis Foundation, as well as the program today, and many others, do have industry support. And the one thing that I will say, even in the clinical trial commentary, is it's really that partnership with all stakeholders, our industry partners, our payers, our patients, that we really can bring these treatments forward and really all help individuals overall, which is what we're trying to do. So if we move on to the next slide. So I'll very quickly talk about the role of clinical trials and some elements, and then I will pass it over to Dr. Shariari and to Dr. Ringdahl, and they'll be able to speak to their experiences as well. But within clinical trials, some of the things we'd like to talk about today is how treatments are developed and how and when they're really available within our community. Oftentimes we'll see a press release, or we'll see a commercial, or maybe we'll see a blurb about something that was presented at a conference. It says there's this great new treatment, and the treatment may be in phase 2 of clinical development. So we get a number of questions as to when would that treatment be available? When can I give that to my daughter who's suffering, from condition X? And really, it's a lot longer and it's a lot more expensive process than a lot of people realize. So I think really understanding the grounding of that. I think this also informs a lot of the national discussions right now that are ongoing for drug pricing and trying to find a balance there. And then really, why are clinical studies important? What role do they serve? We have all these great treatments, and they have to be evaluated before they can be used. But how is that done, and why? I lecture on this at the university level, and I spend really semesters, hours, talking about the process and how clinical trials have evolved and how they've been refined and defined over the years. We'll touch on the high level today, and then I would encourage you to seek out other resources. It's a very fascinating story, and it's very important for you to understand if you are going to participate in a clinical trial. I'll touch on the phases of clinical development, what the important elements of clinical studies are, how side effects are determined, how they're reported, how clinical study design is very important for how the drug can be used, and what some of those measures are in finding out how the drug can be used. And then is participating in a clinical study right for you? So if we can go to the next slide. So this is a slide that you'll see many iterations of. If you Google drug development, there are many depictions and graphics of this process. But this is one of my favorite because I like this funnel depiction where you have all of these potential compounds going into the initial process, being experimented in a laboratory in a bench setting, potentially in animal work. And you can see that over time, when a company may say, we would like to find a drug to treat psoriasis. We use that as an example. And they may have 10,000 or more compounds that they try to evaluate initially. From that, when they go through the laboratory testing, they move into cellular testing, they move into animals to see if it's safe. It very quickly gets funneled down to what can be produced affordably, what is safe, what looks like it has the attributes to potentially work within a disease state. And as you can see, this gets whittled down even further when it goes into clinical development, when it's evaluated in human beings. And then finally, hopefully, you go through the phases of clinical development and you come out at the end with a medication that's effective and that's safe. But if you think about the progression through this funnel, oftentimes it's shown without the time and the cost associated. So on this funnel, I included these two arrows on the left and right-hand side of the slide. This process could take 10 to 15 years in certain cases, and it could cost $2 to $3 billion to get through that process. So many companies do not have the resources to progress this type of a program. And so that's why we have larger pharmaceutical organizations that can do that. But in this process, when you see even the first results of a clinical study that look good, it still may be months or years before it's actually available. So if we go to the next slide. So how are clinical trials done? So you saw that funnel and that depiction, and in that very small segment, it said, clinical studies. But that small segment involves thousands of people, lots of monetary investment, lots of time. But I wanted to go through kind of the phases so that we can understand. So when a compound is found to show activity in the laboratory, or preclinical, as it shows here with the purple test tube, after that happens, there is an application filed with the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, and every country has their own regulatory basis, but I'll focus on the US today. They apply to have approval to go into humans. Once that approval is granted from the Food and Drug Administration, phase 1 begins. And that is a smaller phase. It goes into a smaller number of participants, and the focus is really on safety and determining what dose may be safe and effective. After that phase, it moves into phase 2. These are a larger number of participants. Oftentimes, these participants have the disease state, so they can actually test the effectiveness of the drug. And because they're now looking at the dose that they hope will be effective in a larger number, they also begin looking at side effects. If everything continues to go well, the drug or the compound, the treatment, will then move into phase 3. This is really expanding the study to a larger number of people. In many cases, if it's a disease that impacts thousands of people or millions of people, the phase 3 trials may be thousands of participants. Now, in some of the conditions that are more rare, there still may be a smaller number, but it's diversifying. You heard Alicia, as a patient panelist, mention we really need to diversify clinical trials. We need to have those participating in the clinical trials be representing the community. And in phase 3, that expansion and that diversification really becomes a priority. This is looking also at potential comparators. So if there is a drug that's available on the market, or a therapy or treatment that's available on the market for a particular disease, in phase 3, it's an opportunity to compare the new medication to an existing medication. After all of this is done, a major effort is made to file what they call a new drug application with the Food and Drug Administration. The FDA reviews that application to confirm the safety and the effectiveness, and then hopefully they will give approval for use within humans. Many of us have been more aware of this FDA review process through the recent COVID-19 vaccines, right? We heard a lot about emergency use authorization, formal review. And if you go onto the Food and Drug Administration website, if you're interested, they have a lot of information about this whole process. After a drug is approved, there's also what they call a phase 4 period, and that's really looking at some of the longer term effects and in a larger population. This may also be looking at other populations, so women that are expecting, older populations, et cetera. And so that's really the clinical trial process. And from that, hopefully we'll have newer medications for different therapeutic areas, and we'll also have the ability to say we don't have a treatment in this area, let's put it through the clinical trial process, and we'll come out with a safe and effective medication on the other end. If you go to the next slide. So what are the elements of a clinical study, and how does it all work? So a clinical study is really driven by the study protocol. All the details that are going to happen within the clinical study itself to guide the participants, to guide the individuals administering the study, everything goes back to that study protocol. The study protocol is approved by the Food and Drug Administration. It's also approved by ethics committees to make sure that everyone can participate in the study and be safe. For those that participate in the study, they actually sign an informed consent form. They're given all the information, the risks, the potential benefits, et cetera, to participate in the study. And once they agree, they will sign the form, and then they're eligible to participate. They have all the sites that conduct the study, so going into clinics or hospitals where individuals can come in and be part of the study. Those individuals participate through study visits, where they come in and will have certain assessments done to see if the drug is working and to see if it's safe. From all that, all the data are collected, and those data are then compiled and evaluated, again, in a variety of ways so that we have a good understanding of how the drug is working. The safety assessments take place. Throughout the study, we want to make sure that it is safe, and so as participants are part of a study, they report adverse events. So anything that's happening when they're taking that drug. The interesting thing about adverse events is it could be anything. Someone could stub their toe, and that has to be reported as an adverse event. They could be in a car accident, and that is reported as an adverse event. And so sometimes it may be in relation to the drug, and then sometimes it may not be. And the investigator of the study tries to determine if it is or is not related. The difficulty with this is everything is reported. And so when you're watching television at night and you're seeing a new medication come out and they give the long list of side effects, that's because everything was reported in these clinical studies. So you have to keep that in mind when you're thinking all of these things may happen. The ones that are more common or that are happening more often are usually highlighted. They'll be highlighted by your physician. They're highlighted by the product information for the medication. But that's why oftentimes you hear all of these side effects. And so sometimes, quite honestly, the medications may sound very, very scary, even though they may not be, that dangerous. They're safe, and it's all about kind of weighing the potential risks and the benefits. And then the study's reported, and this is the information that is made public, whether it be through press release or through publications, and this is how the general community learn about the studies. So if you go to the next slide. So again, monitoring safeties and adverse events, safety and adverse events, how does this relate to the side effects? So every adverse event is reported. This is part of the product insert, which we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. It is required to have these promoted, and so that is part of the commercial saga you see. I always think about if you've ever seen the Star Wars movies where they have all the words at the beginning and they're rolling up. I sometimes feel like that with the side effects. They list them all out. And it's really thinking about what those side effects are and what the risk benefit, and then how they're collected. So I always like this cute little report of side effects because they use this for a lot of pediatric studies where they show the tummy upset or the headache or whatever else it may be. But the reality of it is this applies really to all clinical studies, is they're thinking about all the ways that these side effects can happen. If you go to the next slide. Okay, so how is efficacy measured? I already talked a little bit about the safety. How do you know if the medication is actually effective? So within a clinical study, there are objective measures. So for things like psoriasis, you look if the skin is clearing. Maybe in a cardiovascular drug, you look at your electrocardiogram. If it's an infectious disease study, you look at if the infection is resolving or not. In addition to those clinical measures, you also have patient-reported outcomes. So we heard from our patient panel how the disease is really impacting them. Are those things improving, both from a mental but in a physical sense as well? So getting information from the patients is really very, very important to see if this drug is worth bringing to market. I'm very grateful to say that the Food and Drug Administration, as well as many regulatory agencies around the world, are really putting more of an emphasis on that patient input, and I think that that's something that you'll see continue to increase and improve, as long as our patient community is willing to voice what they're experiencing. And so I think from a patient advocacy perspective and all of us working together as stakeholders, it's really important that we mention that. How these are measured is set up as study objectives and endpoints. Oftentimes they're composite measures, meaning there's more than one that contribute. Sometimes there's a hierarchy. If it works really well from this aspect, does it work well for this aspect or this aspect? And there's maybe some that are more important than others. The other important point about clinical studies is prospective analysis. So all these things are outlined in advance to make sure that things are working as planned for that particular therapeutic area. There are some surprises. I think all of us have heard the Viagra story. You know, initially it was being evaluated as a blood pressure medication. Obviously, there was another side effect that people recognized, and that's what that drug ended up being marketed for. But usually you try to prospectively plan out what you're going to be looking for, and that provides confidence to the regulatory authority too, that yes, you knew what you were planning for, this is what's going to be evaluated. And then there's a lot of regulatory guidance and approval for efficacy measurements. So depending on the therapeutic area, the FDA has put out certain guidelines to say if you're going to develop a drug for osteoarthritis, these are the things you should be looking for. These are the measures you should be using. So if you go to the next slide. So really, what's in a name? So the big thing is you go through the whole clinical trial process, and the application is filed for an approval with the Food and Drug Administration at the end. But how do you know how the drug is going to be used, and how is that defined for the community? How is that information provided to providers so that they can best care for their patients? So there is a product insert or a label, and within this product insert or label, this is a template shown on this slide that the Food and Drug Administration provides. The specific indication or use is outlined in this case, disease characterizations, maybe the mechanism of action of the therapy, which doses should be used, side effects, interactions with other drugs, etc. But it is very important what is included on this product insert, because if you're thinking about even how a disease is characterized, so for instance, we're all at the Autoimmune Summit today. For years, psoriasis was thought of only as an autoimmune condition. But really what we're knowing now is it is mediated by the entire immune system. And so immune-mediated is the most appropriate terminology for psoriasis. How that's depicted in the label may determine how a provider may use it, but also importantly, if a payer will provide reimbursement or coverage for this medication. So months and months go into how this label is developed for each new treatment. Companies that develop the treatments, patient groups, others weigh into how it is characterized in this label. But when you're going to go on a therapy for the first time, this is going to be your guide. And if you have questions, there are a number of resources you can reach out to, but this is ultimately what comes from those clinical trials, and all the research that goes into it goes right down to this label. So if you go to the next slide. So really, we talked about why clinical trials are important as far as developing the medicines, but what is a benefit, or what are the benefits for participating in a clinical study? What do patients see right away? So if you have a condition and you're very concerned about having new treatments, the treatments that you're currently on may not be effective for you, or you may want to have more options. You may want to have more options for your children because you know it might be a potential for them. The benefit of participating in the trial is obvious. You want to have new therapies come forward. But immediately, one of the things is that you may not have a treatment that's working for you, and you can participate in a study, and you may gain access to these treatments. You may receive care from specialists or physicians that you might not typically be able to be part of. In addition, you can be part of bringing these new treatments to market. You can play an active role. Our patient panelists talked about feeling empowered for their condition, whether that be through advocacy or through research. Clinical trial is a great way that you can do that. Determining if a clinical trial or research is right for you, there are a lot of resources for this as well. National Institutes of Health has a great guide on this through their Aging Institute, but also through their other institutes. So I would highly encourage you to reach out and look for those. And then if you go to the last slide, there are a lot of other patient resources available too, as you heard in the prior section, the National Psoriasis Foundation, our Patient Navigation Center. But there are a number of organizations that you can reach out to and ask about clinical studies. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Shariari, and we look forward to hearing more about the research advances.
Great. Thank you so much, Stacy. That was amazing. I'm Netta Shariari. I'm a board-certified dermatologist, but I have a special interest in autoimmune diseases affecting the skin, which is why I'm doing a dermatology rheumatology fellowship at Brigham and Women's Hospital. So I have no financial disclosures to share, but the reason that I'm here today is to be able to discuss some of the newer medications that are in the pipeline for different dermatologic autoimmune conditions. It's really exciting how far research has come in terms of finding agents that can really help these different conditions. It seems just like, not a long time ago where our hands were really tied in terms of treatments. We were limited with topical medications or few oral medications for our patients. So it's really amazing how far we've come and how clinical trials has really pushed the edge and allowed for us to have more treatments in our armamentarium for our patients. So first, I wanted to talk a little bit about psoriasis. For those who are not familiar, psoriasis is a chronic immune-mediated disease. It impacts about 1 to 3% of the patient population, and it truly impacts our patients both from the physical standpoint as well as the psychological perspective. So psoriasis involves the skin, but it can also manifest in the form of psoriatic arthritis, so involving the joints. But there's other associations with psoriasis as well, including heart disease, depression, and diabetes. Now, we have a number of excellent biologics in the market right now for psoriasis, but there's certain limitations that come about, with any medication. So some of our patients who are on these medications, may experience one of the following things. Either they may get no response to the treatment, they may initially have a response to the medication, but then with time that response fades. And then some patients just have, side effects from the medication, so it warrants stopping the medication altogether. So that's why it's still really important for us to, be involved in clinical trials in psoriasis, to be able to provide more available treatment options for our patients. So to further talk about maybe some of the things that are in the pipeline, I just wanted to briefly go over what we know in terms of what causes psoriasis. So psoriasis is, triggered by some sort of an environmental, factor in patients who have certain genes that make them more susceptible. So here you can see on the left that there is skin without psoriasis. And what we know is there's a particular molecule known as interleukin 17 or IL-17 that's been shown to be directly involved in causing psoriasis. So you can see here that the skin is thickened and you would get these classic psoriasis plaques. Now we have a few biologics in the market that actually block this interleukin 17 or IL-17. But what I want to talk about is a newer biologic that blocks this IL-17 that's in the pipeline in clinical trials. So what we know from research studies is that this new IL-17 blocker, in comparison to, no medication at all or placebo, does, really well at clearing psoriasis. But what's more telling about this medication is how it's doing in comparison to some of the medications we already have in the market. So a phase 3 trial that was comparing this new IL-17 blocker to one of the previous IL-17 blockers in the market found that when we look at the rate of completely clearing the skin, so 100% of psoriasis gone, that with this new medication, you have 67% of patients who get completely clear versus 46.2% in those patients who are on the older IL-17 blocker. Now, I just wanted to point out that both of the medications are injected every 4 weeks. So from that standpoint, they're very similar. One thing to note though, and Stacy, alluded to this quite well, is, we always have to be aware of side effects. So with this new IL-17 blocker, they did note that patients have a higher risk of getting oral candida or yeast infection in the mouth in comparison to the older IL-17 blocker. So it was 19.3 versus 3%. But what researchers did note is that the oral yeast infection was on the more milder and moderate side. And by giving antifungal medication to the patients, that they were able to do quite well, and it didn't, warrant stopping treatment. And just for you to also know, in comparing this new IL-17 blocker to some of the other medications in the market that have a different mechanism of action, so like an anti-TNF inhibitor, in comparison to some of the other mechanisms, this actually did better than those. So we're looking forward to seeing, the promise that this holds for our patients in actual practice. Now, for some of those psoriasis patients who, either have milder psoriasis or, they may not feel comfortable taking something systemic, like they'd rather not take something oral or an injectable. Well, there is a topical medication that's in the pipeline that is not a steroid. As dermatologists, our biggest concern with steroids is that it can thin the skin out. But this new medication, because it's not a steroid, there is no risk for that. It's an anti-inflammatory medication. It can restore that normal skin barrier. And when in clinical trials looking at phase 3, when they compared this new cream in comparison to placebo or no drug at all, they saw that when they looked at the goal of 75% improvement in the patients, that 56% did better with this new cream versus 5% who didn't get any drug. What they did also was to compare it to another topical that's typically used for psoriasis, which is a vitamin D derived medication topical. And after 12 weeks, once again, looking at that 75% improvement goal, they saw that the newer topical was able to achieve that goal in 50.4% of patients versus 38.5%. But of course, we have to be aware of side effects. So this newer medication, to a small percent, can cause something called folliculitis or inflammation of the hair follicle. And then contact dermatitis in another smaller percent of 11% of patients. And that's, a localized kind of allergic reaction to the topical medication. Now, another autoimmune condition is dermatomyositis, which is quite rare. And the main organ systems affected here are going to be the muscle, where patients experience significant amount of weakness, and then the skin. Other associations include lung disease and cancer. But what's really interesting and promising in the world of dermatomyositis right now is that from the preclinical data standpoint, what was done was they took blood from patients with dermatomyositis, and when they analyzed it, they found that there was this particular molecule known as type 1 interferon that seemed to be related to how bad the skin was doing. So right now they created a drug that targets this type 1 interferon. And so phase 1 data was done, which didn't show any major adverse effects, which is part of the reason we do a phase 1 clinical trial. And then phase 2 is currently undergoing to see how effective it is. So it holds a lot of promise, and we're very excited to see how it's going to do in clinical trials. So hydronitis suppurativa, or HS, is a disease that's characterized by these inflammatory nodules, abscesses, and fistulas. And so this can lead to significant amount of scarring, and it impacts the folds of the skin. So under the arms, the groin, underneath the breast. And it's really, really impacts our patients' quality of life. And it's partially because, these nodules can be really painful, making patients, unable to be active because of where the location of these lesions are, which is a prone area. And some patients are really suffering in silence from the disease because this disease isn't getting the attention it deserves. But there are a lot of clinical trials going on, and I wanted to draw your attention to one example of that. So like we talked about with psoriasis and how IL-17 has been found to play a role in it, it's also playing a role in HS. So a pilot study was done looking at a 17 blocker that's normally we use for psoriasis, and they injected patients every week for 24 weeks. And 100% of the patients were able to reach their goal of improvement. So this seems really promising, and we're excited to see what other information we're going to gain from trials. Another autoimmune condition is lupus. So lupus is one that involves a lot of different organ systems. So it can involve the skin, the heart, kidney, and lungs. And for dermatologists, we are mainly focused on the skin aspect of things. And just to highlight to you how bad the skin can get, this is a patient with lupus, and you can see on the left there's involvement of the face, the upper chest. You have another patient on the right where there's extensive involvement of the back, and it can be really debilitating for patients. They have a lot of itching, a lot of discomfort. Now, currently, there are no FDA-approved biologic medications for skin lupus. We do have 2 medications that are FDA-approved, but it's more for systemic lupus. So what has been done is some, preclinical data has shown that lupus, similar to dermatomyositis, has some involvement of the type 1 interferon molecule. So there's a biologic target for the type 1 interferon that's an injection or an infusion every 4 weeks. And from some preliminary data, it was shown that if you look at patients and how many of them had greater than 50% improvement of their skin lupus, they found that there was a much higher frequency of those patients on this medication versus standard treatment. Of course, like we need to go through, more of the clinical trials to really gauge how well the efficacy is, but it seems quite promising. Adverse effects, in the case of this particular medication includes to a small percent upper respiratory infections and then infusion-related reactions, because it can be given as an infusion. Now, Pemphigus vulgaris is a condition that causes blistering of the skin and the mucosa. So that's going to involve, the skin, of course, but the throat, the eyes, the genitals. And to simply put it, it's because the immune system is attacking the skin, and it can be really debilitating for our patients who have Pemphigus vulgaris. What is really exciting in the world of clinical trials is that there is one new biologic infusion that is under study. So some, data that's come out has been from phase 1b/2 data, which showed that, they included patients who, with Pemphigus vulgaris, who had failed other sort of conventional treatments that are used. And when they gave this medication every week, IV doses of it for 5 weeks, that 50% of the patients saw improvement, with follow-up. The most common side effect that was noted, however, was headache. So overall, though, I think the message that I wanted to get across, there's a lot more studies happening right now in clinical trials, but I kind of cherry picked some of, the more interesting ones that are happening right now and kind of, more interesting pressing data for it. But it's really an exciting time in clinical trials in dermatology, especially with autoimmune conditions. And I'm personally looking very much forward to seeing how these drugs are going to impact our patients. So if there's any questions, I have left my email address here. I'm happy to answer any questions via email or now if possible.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shariani. And Dr. Ringdahl, if you could maybe give a little bit about yourself, because you have a very interesting background from a patient perspective, but also from a professional perspective. And we very much look forward to hearing your sharing. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Dr. Netta. That's exciting stuff. I like to hear that. So it's great to be with y'all today. My name is Dr. Brett Ringdahl. I'm a clinical health psychologist. I specialize in working with folks who have chronic medical disease conditions and primarily sleep disorders and other mental health concerns. So I work with folks who have a wide range of, anything chronic in conjunction with any sort of mental health problem. I'm also a psoriasis patient advocate and psoriatic arthritis as well. I'm also in the triple autoimmune club. I have type 1 diabetes, psoriasis, and psoriatic arthritis myself. So, and that's kind of the lineup is how they all happen. So I was diagnosed with psoriasis at about age 20, and I think progressed really quickly, like many folks who have psoriasis do. I think I probably jumped right to the biologics right around when Howard from our last session did back in the early 2000s. I failed all of them. I mean, I had no response to any of the TNF alpha inhibitors. I had no response to light therapy, oral medications, topicals. I mean, you name it, we tried it, didn't work. So I was kind of in a pickle. I was getting to the point where my disease progression was getting to be almost, 90% coverage. And, we were, I couldn't sleep, it was very painful, struggling with depression, obviously not much of a social life, not going out very much. So we had a lot on our shoulders. I was also starting my grad program at this time, and I moved to the Twin Cities actually. And circling back to what Stacy said about not being able to locate these clinical trials, it was actually my endocrinologist who referred me to a university, and lo and behold, I had no kind of connection that a university would have a dermatology department that actually sees patients. and does, clinical work aside from research. So, I went and wasn't, putting much stock in it. I didn't have a lot of expectations. I met with a physician who just, she saw me, I gave her my history, the whole laundry list of everything. And she just looks at me and says, I think I have something that's going to work. Like, I really do. I want to put you in a clinical trial. What do you think? And I was just kind of like, I don't know, you tell me. So I was kind of dumbfounded. I didn't really know what to do. But there was something about the way that she presented it. She was like, just give me 3 months. Like, can you just give me 3 months and we'll see. I was like, that's a long time. And my psoriasis is really bad and you're going to take away my topicals and my, everything. So I agreed to start, and, she said, I was concerned about the medication being possibly in the placebo group. It's not going to work. It's, we're going to get to the 12 weeks and it's going to be worse. So I had all this, going on in my head. And she said, let's just pretend it's the placebo, like right now. And what we'll do is we'll work together to develop an exit plan, exit strategy. And that stuck with me. I love that because, an exit strategy I can do. And I like to use that with some of my patients as well too. She also really emphasized the mental health aspect of what was going on. I mean, she could tell that I came to the clinical, I wasn't one of the patients that comes to the clinical trial full of questions and full of concerns and full of, information and, wanting to engage. And I didn't have any questions. I needed a solution, and I was kind of at the, the end of the line. And kind of exhausted, as I think many of you can kind of relate to, with dealing with three medical diseases simultaneously. So she made it a point of making sure that I was supported, and during the clinical trial, during the initiation of the trial, and then throughout, with support. And for me, that looked like individual therapy, and I really advocate that. And I don't know if it's talked about enough, but having a support structure, having some sort of somebody that you can rely on, you can talk to through this, because it's a long time. I mean, some of these, back then, these medications took a while to kick in. So that was hugely important for me looking back. I think that was the key to kind of getting me through the trial itself. So I wasn't on the placebo. Spoiler alert, I made it into the, I was on the highest dose actually, and I made it, I think, 4 or 5 months. I was about 75% clear, and by the end of the trial, I was 90, 100% good. It was great because the study hooked me up with medication continuance following the end of, I saw the trial through, was able to stay on the medication, ended up staying on it for 4 years until one day I had a flare and we had to try something else. But that happens. Insurance changes, moves. We're all kind of used to kind of that bounce around. So yeah, my involvement in the clinical trial process, I think, was not only, I think, kind of out of nowhere, but it was hugely important. It was a big paradigm shift for me in terms of how I thought about my psoriasis, how I thought about how I'm managing my health, how, what are the possibilities of a future with, hope. Like, that's really what I got out of the whole thing. I got some hope, and I got kind of like a new beginning. And I've been blessed and fortunate enough to walk around for a number of years with no psoriasis. And for a person who's got psoriasis, that's what better thing is there in the world. So I'm a huge advocate for even just consideration of participation in clinical trials. I weigh the pros and cons, talk with your people, talk with your support group, talk with your partners and your friends to see if it's the right decision for you. But I think it takes a really brave person to take kind of a leap of faith and do something that's kind of unknown for the advancement of our community. And so that was really a big deal for me. That gave me a lot of self-efficacy, really, in coming from a place that was really kind of bad and full of psoriasis to a place where, I felt, I was really putting something, in to help. So yes, huge proponent. If you have any questions about anything in particular regarding the clinical trials, feel free, or you just want to chat, feel free to send me a message or an email. I'd love to hear from you. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ringdahl. I think one of the things that you really highlighted that I think is important that all of us probably could have touched on is just gathering more information about clinical trials that are out there. So, clinicaltrials.gov is a very good resource. It oftentimes is more used from a scientist and a provider standpoint now. I'm actually involved in an initiative to try to bolster clinicaltrials.gov to have it be more patient-friendly and have a patient page. We're not there yet on every trial, but I do think it is a good resource. And then, ultimately talking to your provider. It's really about the patient-provider partnership as far as access to care, whether it be the medications that are currently available and or being involved in a clinical study. And there are so many providers that want to help and that are familiar with clinical research and clinical trials. And so I think that if your current provider isn't comfortable with that or not necessarily involved, I know that they can always refer you to a colleague that is. And I think that will make a big, big difference too. I'd like to, we've had a couple of questions come in. I will say that some of the questions that have come in about specific dermatological conditions and their autoimmune nature and that type of thing, we'll try to address, offline for that. But if there are any other specific questions regarding clinical trials as a whole, I'd love to have people add them to the chat, and we're more than happy to address them as a panel. Okay, well, if we don't have anything further, we'll end the session. All of us are available if there are further questions. And thank you both very much for participating and sharing your stories and your expertise today. And it's been a pleasure to be here with everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. It was such a pleasure.
Thanks,
Take care.
y'all. Thank you. Take care. Be well.
Enjoy the conference.